Okay, thank you everyone for coming this morning. This is so fun. And if you've ever planned events, it all comes into action today, right? All of the background work, all of the planning comes to fruition today. So I'm just thrilled to have the presenter with us today to present on this topic. And today's session is themed Embodied Resistance, the Politics of Existence and Political Messaging. And this is Hash Brown, and I'm gonna let him introduce himself and his presentation. I think you're in for a real treat. There'll also be plenty of time for question and answer after, so please don't hold back. I know that many of you are here for your classes, so also be sure to use the QR codes that are conveniently located on the backs of the chairs to sign in, and we'll be sure to contact your professors. Okay, Hash.
And for the recording, should I be using the mic religiously or? Okay, I'm getting nods. Okay, so the title of my talk is The Efficacy of, let's see, is it up? Yes, we're good, okay. The Efficacy of Mere Existence, Political Paralysis and the Zhuangzi. Originally, I wanted to talk about more than Zhuangzi, but it turns out China is quite a handful. There's a lot to try and bend your brain to understand a very different way of thinking. But my name is Hash. I'm an admin here and also studying Chinese. This is why I'm presenting on China. And Zhuangzi is one of my favorite people to talk about and to research, and I'm very, very obsessed, which is where this presentation begins. So my obsession with ancient Daoist sage Zhuangzi is, among other things, probably a kind of escapism. Zhuangzi lived in a time that didn't have a lot of the problems that we have. So when you're studying ancient China, it's honestly a nice breather. You get to push pause on the political crisis that is wreaking havoc on our world and hacking it to pieces and, meditate a little bit. Maybe read some Chinese poetry. His world didn't have presidential elections. It didn't have impending economic recession. It didn't have climate change. It didn't have a lot of the problems that are stressing us out all the time. The Zhuangzi itself, which is a Daoist scripture, is a delightful book to read. It's mostly a collection of fantastic stories, philosophical anecdotes, and some historical fan fiction, to be honest. Zhuangzi himself, who is a character in the Zhuangzi, is also a delightfully strange character. If you're trying to picture what he's somewhere in between a crazy uncle, a kind old farmer, and Santa Claus. Politically speaking, he really doesn't like to get involved, quite famously. And it's very easy to read the Zhuangzi as advocating for a kind of political escapism. However, that being said, he is also someone who seems to be fairly respected and well regarded in his culture. People in his time seem to have a kind of envy for his carefree lifestyle, even including the great Confucius, or at least that's what Zhuangzi would tell you. Now, as difficult as it is to take a political message out of the Zhuangzi, it is a profoundly broken and convoluted book. There are some things I think you can pull out of the Zhuangzi, and importantly, I don't think that escapism is the thing that you should be pulling out of the Zhuangzi. Now, there is a famous story that everyone points to when they talk about what Zhuangzi thinks about politics. He had one big chance during his life, as the story goes, to take a role in politics, and he turned it down because he would prefer to be fishing. Or specifically, he says that he would prefer to drag his tail in the mud like a happy turtle. So that's kind of what Zhuangzi thinks about politics. But there are a few things about the Zhuangzi that make me think it's problematic to see this as a type of escapism. The first is that it might not be possible to actually live in the time that Zhuangzi lived and be a truly escaped from reality type of person. He lived in a really problematic time. This is the Warring States period of ancient China. It was the most tumultuous time that they had ever seen. Everything was on fire. Everyone was fighting everyone. And so practicing political escapism would be very, very difficult. And if Zhuangzi was trying to practice a type of escapism, he's doing a very terrible job. Throughout the Zhuangzi, you're actually constantly faced with a very graphic depiction of violence, kind of in a crazy uncle sort of way. And on top of that, he is constantly pointing to examples of poverty and death and political crisis as things that we can learn from. If he's trying to hide from it, he's doing a terrible job. The thing that makes you maybe feel like he's practicing an escapism is just that when he talks about these things, he approaches it with such a delightful, carefree attitude that you never feel the crushing weight of the crisis. And this is what has made me start to think that Zhuangzi might have something valuable for us today. Because today, we are also living in a pretty chaotic time. We are feeling like we can't escape our political situation. But we are definitely feeling the crushing weight. So if Zhuangzi can find a way to live in a tumultuous time and not feel the political crushing weight, then maybe we can learn a little bit about how he does that. In hindsight, I thought maybe this, if I knew how to do it, I would have this be like a live feed from Twitter. Because it really is pretty self-evident what the global crisis is like right now. It's very chaotic. We know everyone is having it flood their feeds. It's something you can't escape. It's something that is constantly inundating every part of your life with this image of a profoundly broken and convoluted world. It makes us feel more than ever that we want change, but also somehow stability. And there's a little bit of a paradox there, where everything is on fire and we want to put out the fires, but we also want to change the world, but we also don't want the world to change. And there are things that we can immediately point to that we think of as things that we can do to actually change our political situation. And we talk about them all the time. They're things that everyone feels the need to engage in, but no one really ends up doing them. And actually, the more you get into it, the deeper you get into political crisis, the more you start to realize just how big of a burden this crisis is. You start realizing just how large of a monstrosity our political environment is. And you start to feel like there is nothing that you can do about it. And if you were to do something about it, it would go to really extreme ends very quickly. And that burden weighs on us heavier and heavier and heavier until eventually we end up just being stuck at like 2 o'clock in the morning, scrolling on your phone, feeling like it's just the end. This is political paralysis, one of the subjects of this presentation. And immediately I want to point out that political paralysis is happening on multiple registers. So on the one hand, you have things like doom scrolling, which is a fairly new phenomenon. It's like a scarily new phenomenon. It's happened within like the last 5 to 10 years. And it literally wouldn't have been possible more than 15 years ago because we didn't have the technology for it. It's a very personal and very psychological kind of paralysis. It makes you feel like you can't do anything. And kind of scarily, that also might not really matter. It might not really matter whether or not you actually can't do something about it. We can completely manufacture this kind of paralysis. Sorry, let me get a drink. On the other hand, we have paralysis that is happening on a larger scale. We have systemic issues that make it feel like change is impossible, that maybe actually make change impossible. And this is not new. This is something that has been around forever, and it definitely was around during Zhuangzi's time. It was here with us in every political situation to some extent. Today just might be a particularly bad example. And then you have the way in which these two scales interact with each other, and this is the political paralysis epidemic that we are facing. The way in which issues in politics affect our psychology to make us less likely to participate in politics and change the problems that are making us feel this way in the first place. It's a vicious cycle, and it particularly affects vulnerable populations, or targeted populations as well. The classic example to point to right now is the trans community. If you're adjacent to the trans community or in the trans community, more so than ever, you are feeling the need to fight for your existence. But at the exact same time, the fact that your existence is under attack makes it so that right now you're feeling more exhausted than ever, more discriminated against than ever, and more abused than ever. The fact that you are in crisis makes it more difficult to act against the crisis. And that is the sinister logic of it all. It gets us to a situation in which our society is averse to its own political determination. This is just a statistic pulled from Pew Research, and I apologize, the 9 on the last row is supposed to be a 4, and I realized last night. But you find yourself in a situation where the majority of people are feeling exhausted and angry just at thinking about politics, let alone participating in it. I mean, try and pursue political change when only 10% of your population is consistently hopeful, and only 4% of your population is consistently excited about getting something done. This is where our politics gets us. This is where our reaction to politics inevitably ends. And it's kind of despairing, but this is where zhuangzi might be useful. See, zhuangzi doesn't seem to be affected by this logic. This kind of crisis just seems to bounce right off of zhuangzi. He gets off of the train at the very beginning, when you felt the need to do something in the first place. Zhuangzi, throughout the Zhuangzi, the book, there is a reoccurring vignette that I think illustrates this. We might call the vignette the dissuasion and demise of the political activist. Throughout the story, there are several Chinese characters from Chinese history that are given an opportunity or a motivation to participate in politics. This happens to Confucius, Yanhui, Zilu, Huizi, and Zhuangzi. They find themselves in a situation where, for very good reason, they feel empathetically like they need to take action, like they need to do something, like they need to go participate. And then the story always goes one of two ways. First, someone shows up and explains to them exactly why this is a terrible idea. So this is just one example from chapter 4, not chapter 5. I need to actually go through and fact check my numbers, I think. But this is an example from chapter 4 of the Zhuangzi. And I'm just going to read it. So someone is explaining why it's a bad idea to try and change the political status quo. Quote, if you let the external compromise, the political problems that are going on, if you let the external compromise get inside you, it will topple you, destroy you, collapse you, cripple you. Don't you know the story of praying mantis? It flailed its pincers around to stop an oncoming chariot wheel, not realizing that the task was beyond its powers. Here we get the comparison of you and your desire to change politics to a little bug trying to stop a chariot wheel. That's how impossible this situation is. There's something hubristic about trying to engage in politics. Now, if the person that wants to effect political change doesn't take this advice and tries to do it anyways, the inevitable result in all these stories is they die a horrible death. My favorite example of this is Zilu, who tries to go deal with the political strife in the kingdom of Wei and ends up getting executed, hacked to pieces, and pickled as his punishment, and as a cautionary tale for anyone else that would like to do any political meddling. Now, importantly, the message of these vignettes, and I wish we could go through all of them to see how the logic plays out, but the message of these vignettes is not just that political change is difficult. In every instance, there's a surprisingly consistent logic. Surprisingly consistent because zhuangzi is almost never consistent. But the logic of it is that the very thing that makes you feel the need to go and take action often can count as evidence against the success of that action. So maybe there's a ruthless tyrant in Wei, and you want to go do something about it. But because there's a ruthless tyrant in Wei, you're going to get executed. Or maybe there are stupid people in government making stupid decisions, and that makes you want to say something about it. But because there are stupid people in government, saying something about it is going to do nothing. The fact that you are in crisis might make you want to do something, but the fact that you are in crisis makes doing something not as effective as you would want it to be. Put very, very simply, and in other words, the fact that you are in a political pickle is what pickles you. So where does this leave us? Are we supposed to just accept our fate, suffer through it, accept that we are broken and crushed and small and at the whims of the people in power? Well, the short answer for zhuangzi is yes. That is what the inevitable conclusion to this logic is. However, we might feel different about it if we understood what zhuangzi thinks about small, broken, and crippled things. You see, zhuangzi, one of his big teachings, one of the big things you get out of the zhuangzi if you're trying to read it in some therapeutic way, is that he has a kind of love for broken things. The characters in his stories that are in places of dignity, that are in places of respect, are often not the ones you would think of. He's frequently talking about criminals, about invalids. He's talking about people that are facing poverty, people that have died or are in the process of dying. He loves to aestheticize and even deify twisted things and broken things, things that no one wants, things that no one sees as useful. These are the things that he thinks have a particular potency to them. You can see this in Chinese art, where they frequently depict broken and twisted trees because they're an example of something that is useless. You couldn't chop them down and make anything out of them, and there's something about that that they see as particularly beautiful. This quote from Zhuangzi is where he talks about the usefulness of these useless things. I'll just read down, but it basically says, all people know the usefulness of useful things, but no one knows the usefulness of useless things. So what does this mean? It's very hard to wrap your head around. And there's so many different ways that you can think about what this means. But in our context, there's a few ways that I want to point out specifically. The first is that in a more generally Daoist sense, there is a connection between useful things and useless things. Or we might say that anything that we take to have a particular use has some dependency on things that we think of as useless. A very simple and kind of silly example would be this presentation. It has a very particular use. It's here to be educational. It's here to explain something that you didn't know about China. But it depends for its origin and for its success on a lot of things that don't have that same use and purpose. We wouldn't have this presentation if I didn't happen to have a curiosity and obsession with ancient China, which doesn't exist for you to have use out of it. It's just a little thing that I found my way into a few semesters ago, and now I study Chinese. So the point being that in order to get the useful things that you want, you have to recognize their connection and dependence on things that you don't traditionally see as useful. In our context, we might point out that everyone knows the use of useful political things, all those things that I put up on the slide, but we are somehow failing to get them started, which might mean that we are failing to find the use of things that we see as insignificant right now. Like human psychology. There could be facts about human psychology that we are taking to be pointless or useless or insignificant, that really we just, that's the roadblock. That's what's stopping us from being able to get things done if we were trying to get things done. Another way in which Zhuangzi thinks about the usefulness of useless things is that he thinks that broken and useless things have a certain kind of natural resilience against exploitation. If you are not useful, people won't use you. He sees a connection between this impulse that we have to go be engaged and be useful for the world and the likelihood that the systems in our world will take that and use it for their own ends. In a political context, we might point out that there is a multi-billion-dollar industry that profits off of your sense of uselessness in politics. This is something that you don't think about when you're scrolling through Instagram, but the only reason that you are scrolling through Instagram or that Instagram makes it possible for you to infinitely scroll is because they're making money off of it. So Zhuangzi perhaps could point out that when we start to feel useless in politics, we actually start to free ourselves from this political nightmare in a way. And then the last thing about the usefulness of uselessness that I want to point to is that in the Zhuangzi, political cripples, people who have suffered at the hands of oppression, people who are in some way have had their lives disrupted and destroyed because of the political environment that they can do nothing about, these people, Zhuangzi seems to think, are the only ones that are actually grounded in reality. They're the only ones that have an intuitive understanding of what the world is actually like. And consequently, they're the only ones throughout the Zhuangzi that consistently everyone can learn from, and that everyone should be looking up to. Zhuangzi has a lot of fun mocking and making fun of basically everyone in ancient China. But the only people that seem to come away from this unscathed are literally like criminals and people that are missing legs or really, really ugly people. Like they're people that we would traditionally think are the most, displaced, that Zhuangzi seems to think are in the most respected position. And this brings me to the last concept from the Zhuangzi that I want to talk about, which is the illumination of the obvious, which is literally just these two characters, which mean using light. And this has a connection to this idea of being grounded, because Zhuangzi seems to think that the illumination of the obvious is the only thing that can actually cut through the division and the disagreement and the conflict. So what does it mean to use light to participate in the illumination of the obvious? Well, it's up for a lot of debate, and if I were to say that there's a clear meaning to this, then a lot of people in this field would be like, you're crazy. No one knows exactly what Zhuangzi means with these things. But it seems to be something like, if you get rid of this impulse to manage the world, to control the world, if you give up on trying to take positions and take sides and do something, Zhuangzi points out that you aren't left with nothing. In fact, you're actually just left with a closer and more intimate relationship with the world that you are in, with the world that is immediately in front of you, what is obvious and illuminated without you having to try and make sense of it already. There's something about the world when you stop trying to make sense of it that actually has its own sense, that actually you are able to act and understand your world to some degree without trying to make it fit into some political ideology or some image for what the world can be. And this gives broken things, useless people, and the sages, as they wander about through the countryside making fun of people, it gives them a kind of advantage, because they aren't blinded by the stories we tell ourselves about politics, and they can actually just see what is in front of them. In a political context, we might think that this could be described as kind of like the experience you have when you start engaging with someone on the other side of the aisle. And at first, you're just seeing them as blue or red. But then after you talk to them more and more, maybe eventually what they actually are, what actually informs their beliefs, starts to filter through. And you start to actually get this illumination of what they actually are. And it's not red or blue. It's actually just something that you couldn't really explain. It's just there in front of you. Now, trying to use Zhuangzi for political ends is really, really difficult, and probably just not a good idea to begin with. This guy lived like 2,500 years ago. He doesn't know what our political situation is like. But if we are trying to use him for our political ends, which is problematic, I think that this entire presentation leads to asking these two questions using light, or using the illumination of the obvious. So the first question is, what does political success look like to you? This is the question we all start with in politics. We think about what is happening in the world and what we think should happen in the world. So what does it look like? Does it look like your side of the aisle winning and the other side just kind of like, I don't know, disappearing? Does it look like this revolution that everyone's been talking about finally happening? And at what point in you imagining what political success looks like did you stop looking at the world in front of you? The point being that Zhuangzi wants to point out that people who are trying to engage with the world are being hypocritical in a sense, because they're trying to make the world something that it is not, and they are mad that other people are making the world something that it is not. We can ask this second question. It follows in the same vein and is in line with the theme of this symposium. What would it mean for you to live your values or live your ideals? Again, we can kind of think through this as, okay, well, when I think about what it would mean for me to live my values, I start imagining a version of myself that is just significantly better than the current version. It's a version that gets up in the morning and is like, I'm gonna go change the world, and then goes and does it, and never stops for breaks, never needs to stop for breaks, and the world just bends to my will. That sort of thing is just not real. And the idea that political success for me or the world doesn't match what is really there in front of you is a serious problem. And it's a serious problem when you think about it, because that's what we think of as politics today. We think of politics as imagining a world that doesn't exist and reaching for it. Zhuangzi is going to point out that the people who reach for a world that doesn't exist are reaching for a world that doesn't exist, which means pursuing it, you're just going to run into the world. It's going to hit you like a chariot wheel. So there's a lot of ways that we can think about this, and I don't actually know, how much time do I have? 5 minutes? Fantastic. Okay, so there's a few ways that we can think of this as challenging the way that we think about politics today. The first one is that this might make us reevaluate what we think of as political. It might make us look into our lives and try and suss out the things that we are treating as useless or non-political or things that we don't think of as political success and ask ourselves seriously, is this a political success? I want to come back to the trans example from earlier just because I think it's a good way to illustrate this. With all of the recent bathroom bill stuff crossing the nation and happening here in Utah as well, there is a sense in which the everyday act of choosing which bathroom you are going to use can be a political act. And in our traditional way of thinking about politics, we would think maybe that using the bathroom you think you should use, regardless of the rules, is a clear political act. And maybe conversely, using the bathroom that they have told you to use is also a kind of political act. A kind of like, okay, I'll follow what you want and you won't like it anyways. But what we don't think of as a political act is someone deciding to just avoid bathrooms altogether and just try to get by, never causing any problems. This sort of action, the action that is just kind of like, I'm not going to get in the way, I'm just going to step aside, I'm going to just take this burden for myself, is something we tend to think of as it's not political. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't say, like, F you to anyone, and that means that we can't think of it as political. But Zhuangzi might point out that there is incredibly political about that. If you have friends and family that are avoiding bathrooms, this is going to make you want to do things. There is an effect that still has in the world. And even though it isn't a clear political action, even though the person who's doing it might not be thinking, I am taking a political stance, they might think they're just, doing what people are telling them to, it can still have political implications. And on top of that, we might point out that there are plenty of things in our lives that are really mundane that have clear political use. Things like paying your taxes, things like participating in a census, these are all political acts in a way. We don't think of them as taking political action, but they are everyday things that inform our political world. So why aren't we thinking of them as political action? And this brings me to the second way in which it can challenge the way that we think about politics. And that is that maybe this should also just be the ideal that we are shooting for in politics. A world that doesn't require you to be something you're not in order to then give you the political world that you want. So we could think of a world in which we don't need people to get out of bed every day and be political activist superstars in order for the politics to work. A world that is structured in such a way that it is already attuned to what people need and what people are going through in their lives so that political action doesn't need to happen. So in that sense, that could be the ideal, whereas right now we tend to think of the political ideal as a whole society in which everyone is a revolutionary and everyone is trying to change everything all the time. The last way is that we might apply Zhuangzi's approach to politics by critiquing the way that we think about how we exist, getting better at existing. And this brings me to the last slide here. There is a problem when people try and apply Daoism across the board, which is it usually is taken as a kind of escapism. It's usually taken as a way of just like, stepping out of the world, I'll go meditate and not think about anything. I'll just go, do what I want to, and that's following the Tao. That's just, doing Wu Wei or not trying to impose myself on the world. This is what Taoism looks like. It's not what Taoism looks like. Taoism, I think, as far as I can tell, I don't know Taoism incredibly well, but it requires a type of existence that's very serious about being engaged with the world around it. It's very serious about looking at what's in front of it. It's very serious about evaluating where it actually is in the world and reflecting on it. It is also just very serious about accepting what is actually there and not pretending like there's something more than what is actually there. So one of the caveats to this presentation is that you shouldn't take it as an excuse to not participate in politics. Maybe you should take it as a reason to reevaluate where you actually fit into politics. But you shouldn't take it as an excuse not to participate into politics. And with that caveat, I will also just add the two that I've kind of mentioned throughout, which is that Zhuangzi lived 2,500 years ago. So the idea that his ideas translate perfectly onto our modern world is kind of a silly one at face value. Use his philosophy if you find it useful, but don't pretend that Zhuangzi actually has direct comments on how our reality works today. And then the last one is just that when it comes to political change in our world, this is a very strange world, which means that even accepting the reality of what is right in front of you might not be enough. I don't know. We don't know how this is actually going to go. And so maybe Taoism is no longer applicable because we live in such a different world than what Zhuangzi did. There are similarities, as I've pointed out, but those similarities might not be the end-all be-all. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with, hopefully you can see how this ties into the title of this speech. The title of this presentation is The Efficacy of Mere Existence. And I think that is the point that Zhuangzi is trying to point out, that just existing on its own has a kind of efficacy to it. And when you forget about that, when you forget that just existing is already enough and the only thing that actually exists, then you start to participate in these illusions and these squabbles and these political divisions that only are going to crush people because they're based in something that isn't real. Flip side of that is that just existing is enough, which is the optimistic side of things. Now, whether or not you think that actually ends up being the case in our modern world, I will leave that for you to decide. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Hash. We have plenty of time for some question and answer, and I believe there's a microphone in the back. And so please don't hesitate to participate. I know that I have a lot of questions.
I can run the mic to anyone who has a question.
Yeah.
I don't think I need
Please,
one,
sir.
Probably.
Oh, we'll have to,
Oh, you're recording.
the live stream folks
Yeah.
will want to hear you.
Okay. Yep. All right. So, question. Do you have any sense of what, like, so historically in China, Daoists were very politically active, right? Like there were empires and dynasties that were toppled by Daoist-led rebellions. And so I'm wondering, what would you say, it's kind of an off-the-cuff question, but what would you say would be like a good Daoist political principle or program if you were trying to, say, do Daoist activism, whatever that would look like?
Okay, well, first off, this is a scary question because Ryan here may have just taught me everything that I know, so he knows what I don't. But it's a very good question. And it's one of the things that I think if I were to actually give a good answer, I would need to go study all of the instances of Daoist rebellion, which there are some really impressive ones. One of the things that I do think you could point to as like a principle, though, is this idea that the actions that actually take place in the world, so if we're trying to do an activism, if we're trying to, I don't know, pursue some kind of action, which is already kind of convoluted in Taoism, but the activism and the action in the world, they always would have to follow from the environment that they are in some way. So it would have to be something that happens like automatically. It would have to be something that is grounded in the facts of existence enough that it isn't like I'm gonna go pursue this because I want to change the world, and more just the world is this way, therefore action is the next obvious move. That sort of action is integrated into what is actually there. And I think that's what maybe the Taoist principle would have to, I don't know, kind of orient around.
I have a question. I wonder what you would say to the idea that maybe there are people who aren't praying mantises in front of the cart. Like, there's a difference in power, but that, like, would the Zhuangzi or like a Taoist perspective still say something different than what I might ordinarily think about a person's role in politics, even if they did have more power to affect the world?
Yes. And this is a question that I have been asked in the preparation for this presentation as well. And I think this is one of the things that's really hard to get an intuitive sense for, but as much as Taoism is against this idea of purposeful action or trying to go manipulate and change the world as like I will force my will on the world, it is not against action. It just thinks that action is something that should come out of naturally the world that already exists. So we could think about this kind of question as asking, well, are there people in the world that are situated in such a way that their actions have political consequences more so than others? The answer to this is obviously yes, and this was true in ancient China as well. And for those people, is there some sense in which they should be thinking about their action as politically oriented more so than your average citizen who's just existing? And I think the answer there is also yes. And you see this in the Zhuangzi and also just Taoism more generally, where there's often kind of, you end up with a bifurcation between the way that an average person would practice Taoism and the way like a king might implement Taoism. They end up using a lot of the same principles, but they like to very different ends. A king is situated in such a way that his actions and what it would mean to be a good Taoist king is very different from what it would mean to be a good Taoist minister or a good Taoist citizen. And it's something that actually ends up causing some like a conflict in how Taoism gets applied. There's actually a part in the Zhuangzi that I don't know how to make sense of yet, where it talks about how Taoism might not be a good idea for your average citizen in some ways. And it explains how if the ruler is using Taoism and the people are using Taoism, sometimes this ends up being a problem because they have such radically different things that they're responsible for. So having them try and practice the same practice ends up running you into problems. What to make of that, I don't exactly know.
Thank you.
Don't be shy. We all have questions.
And if you have questions about like Taoism or China more generally, like this is a very difficult thing to kind of just like throw at you. It's like, you know, here's China. Maybe you haven't heard anything about Taoism. And then also here's like my particular interpretation of Taoism and its application in the modern world. So if there's any one of those steps where you're like, I got lost, I would love to try and explain.
Okay, first of all, thank you for that presentation. That was really great. I think there's something really illuminating in even just the idea of trying to examine actions that we might think are more passive, but might have political origins or political beliefs behind them. One question that I had, and I hope I'm not just repeating and maybe am connecting to Elena's previous question, is do you think that there are limitations to existence being enough, kind of in relation to that question about power, but also in relation to like considerations of how like some people, like for example, trans people, which you used as your example, existing alone might be resistance, but for other people, maybe it isn't as much. I don't know. Could you just speak to that a little bit?
Yes. This is like, this question gets at like the real way that this way of thinking about the world splits with the way that we currently think about the world. Because when we ask the question, is existence enough? Or when is existence enough? The implied extension of that is enough for something. And if we think of the for something as something that is like radically different from our current existence, then existence is not enough. If we think that what we are trying to exist for, if like the political outcome that we want is something that requires a lot of willful action and a lot of immediate action, then yeah, existence is not enough. And the Taoist is not going to tell you that you're going to get what you want by just existing. Part of this shift is also changing how you evaluate what your goal is. If you had the same goal and you tried to then apply a Taoist practice, you're not going to get the same goal. But what a Taoist would potentially say, again, it's very difficult to be like, a Taoist would say this, or Zhuangzi would say this. Like, Zhuangzi rarely speaks in his own voice, so it's like, it's difficult to know what he would actually say. But what might be pointed out by the Zhuangzi is that if you're trying to be politically efficacious, if you're trying to actually have some efficacy in the world, trying to impact it in some way, or not trying to impact it, but trying to understand where your impact fits into the world, then keeping those expectations as close as possible to reality is the most efficacious thing to do. Because the moment that they diverge from what is real is the moment they stop having real weight. If you stop thinking about what is really in front of you, you no longer are able to do anything. You end up just participating in illusions and being, destroyed by the fact that your illusions are illusions. So we might say that existence isn't enough for some of the things that we want, but we would say that existence, and merely existence, is the most efficacious thing you can do because it's the only thing you can do. I don't know if that is satisfying, but
Hey, I enjoyed your presentation. Great job. I just had a question about, so we're talking about somebody that was like 400 BCE, right? Do we have original manuscripts from him, or was it passed down? Like, and how important was he? Did people know these were really important words at the time, or was it something discovered later?
Okay, so this is a very good question that I know some things about, but I wouldn't be the most knowledgeable person about. What I do know is that, about 300, 400 BCE, I think is around the time when we think the Zhuangzi at least started to get compiled. Again, it's a very profoundly broken and convoluted book. So there's a lot of chapters that we think were written later. There's, sections of the Zhuangzi that we think are maybe more original than others. There's contention about that. We don't get an actual Zhuangzi until Guoshan is this later character that compiles the Zhuangzi that we know today. And we have copies of that. But that, I think, is, I guess, Ryan would know for sure. Is that around 280? Yeah. So it's several hundred years after. I think this died. It's several hundred years after when we think it originally got compiled. And then from that point, we do have a pretty good record of what changes were happening to it, or we can actually pull up manuscripts for, I think, almost all of it from Guoshan. But before that, it's, just fragments or nothing.
I loved your presentation. And so some of my colleagues are in the room today, and some of them know me better than others. But I love this idea of meaning in the silence or in the space in between. It's such a kind of classic also, right, from oral history work and critical ethnography work from post-colonial spaces, et cetera, et cetera. So it so resonated with me. The struggle I find, though, is how do we communicate this to folks in this space, right? Because in the Western space, meaning is communicated orally, right? Like we're doing today. It's very literal often, right? It's extracted and recreated in very material ways. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of speculate with us on like strategies of how this could be used and how it could look. Because I've had some conversations with my colleagues here and they're like, what?
It's a very good question, and I think it's telling that in the Zhuangzi, this is a regular failure. Like, Zhuangzi is trying to communicate with people and explain, and like a lot of these stories where they're trying to explain, okay, well, here's where you actually fit into politics, and here's why you shouldn't go and do things in politics, or here's why you're wrong about what you think is meaningful in the world. A lot of times, the people that are hearing this don't accept the message. So Zhuangzi failed, and I don't know if I think we could create a method that succeeds better than the guy who invented it. But I would point out that one of the advantages is that this is why Zhuangzi likes broken and kind of lowly things. It's because he thinks that living in your world as a little tiny insignificant human often makes you run up against the fact that you're such a small, insignificant little human, and that your systems for making sense of the world don't actually pan out. A lot of what the Zhuangzi is little stories where people think that they know what's going on, and then something weird happens that they don't understand, and then you don't even really get an explanation for what actually happened. It just kind of hits you over the head, and you're like, existence is weird. Mm-hmm. And that's the sort of thing that I think Zhuangzi appeals to in trying to help people realize that their systems for making sense of the world are maybe ideological or maybe insufficient. It's just that reality is complicated and convoluted, and so your systems of meaning that are neat and nice and make perfect sense are just going to run up against roadblocks. And that's how you come to these realizations in the end. It's not incredibly satisfying because you can't actively go and teach that. It's people have to go experience their place in reality. But
We probably have time for another question. Who's got a percolating question? Nothing else on the zhuangzi? Partiality, ambiguity. Hash, you've given us so much to think about.
Probably too much.
Never too much. Well, if there are no other questions, let's join me in a round of applause in thanking our speaker today. And then be sure to sign in with the QR code if you have not. And then hopefully you know who your instructor is so that we can get that information back to your instructor. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We loved having you here.